It's the light.
That's the best it's gonna be. Yeah. Doesn't look as bad in Twitch though. I don't know if it looks any different for you, but it looks like it's more noticeable in Discord than Twitch for me for whatever reason.
Yeah, I don't really. I mean, I see it, but
Yeah.
it's not that noticeable. I don't think. Let me retweet it. I forgot to do that last week.
I got a tweet first. A little later in the
Oh,
week.
that's.
It's time
Well, I
for...
just retweeted the one from last week then.
YouTube link. And live. Boom. Now it's up.
Make sure that the YouTube one you said is working.
Yep.
Okay. Gotta make sure I mute it.
Yep.
You know how it was broken, my mic just cut out last week. I don't know, maybe it just happened when you started talking that one time because I didn't have any issue after that. So it was fine.
You're saying it was my fault.
Yeah. I just had to
Interesting.
add it around you, man. All right, let's get started. Hello and welcome to episode 106 of the Ego Chall Podcast, and my name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski, and on today's episode, we have a gigantic lawsuit between two of the most popular and most well-known people in Call of Duty esports history, and Activision Blizzard, which is quite big news, I think, and the CDL has returned after the Major 1 break at following Major 1, and we are finally into Major 2 qualifying matches, the 5-6 weeks that we have of them. So we'll be talking about those matches as well as next week's matches. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Like you said, pretty, not really hectic is the right word, but interesting week of developments in Call of Duty and the return of actual action. So we got some decent stuff to talk about.
Yeah, so the biggest news, obviously, is that Hex and Scump are suing Activision Blizzard. So this broke on, what was this, Thursday? The 15th or 16th?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so it was later last week before the CDL matches. It was announced that they're suing Activision Blizzard to the tune of $680 million in damages. So this is a lawsuit filed jointly between them. So it's Hex, Scump, and then Hex LLC, which is Hex's limited liability company. And they're suing Activision Blizzard on the grounds or with charges that Activision Blizzard is essentially running a monopoly with the CDL, that they forced players into signing contracts that limit the opportunities that they can have, that 50% of all sponsorship revenue that the teams make, that goes to the league. There's quite a bit. And I think one of the bigger parts was that Hex accused Activision Blizzard of not allowing him to solely own a CDL franchise. And what he said was he was forced to merge with Envy, and Envy acquired the Optic brand, and that's how we have Optic Texas after we had the Dallas Empire run by Envy, and for I think just one season we had Optic Chicago after Hex acquired the Optic brand, or NRG acquired the Optic brand from OGLA. So obviously a lot of minutia in terms of the legalese that if you want to read the whole thing, you can go and do that. I don't really know why you do that, but Breaking Point did put up a nice little graphic that kind of breaks down what each of the charges that Hex and Scump are levying against Activision Blizzard, what it actually means, and it also breaks down how much each charge they are trying to get out of. So, for example, $120 million. Hex, Scump, and Hex LLC, they accused Activision of running an unlawful monopoly which damaged the Optic brand and IP, and it resulted in allegedly more than $100 million in losses. Obviously, this is a big thing. We're not quite sure how this will end up. What was your initial reaction to all of this? Because, it is definitely the biggest story in Call of Duty esports.
Yeah, initially for me, the initial coverage of the lawsuit seemingly suggested that the lawsuit reportedly involved other CDL owners and in organizations. Later, after more reading the fine print, it was determined seemingly that it's only Hex and Scump and those guys with optics. So that was definitely a I don't want to say it was a twist, but that kind of shifted my thinking a little bit on the lawsuit. I did see on Twitter and discussions around it that like initially it seemed like this could have been a play, speaking on this, as when it seemed like this was first a potential lawsuit from multiple CDL owners. Some discussion around this potentially being a lawsuit with the thought process of potentially trying to push forward or speed up the process that happened with the Overwatch League, where Activision offered like buyouts and stuff and kind of dissolved the Overwatch League to I don't even know the new name, to be honest. It's like Championship Series or Overwatch Championship Series or something. Yeah. So that was my initial thought, and I saw that online too, and that kind of like got the gears turning for me. Was like, if multiple owners were doing this, maybe that's what they're trying to get the gears turning on that process potentially for the CDL, since it just happened with the Overwatch League. Little bit of a different situation now that it's just Hex and Scump. Potentially, maybe that's like part of this and could be an element in trying to speed up the process, but not going to pretend to be a legal expert or anything like that, so I don't really know. There definitely was some interesting things being discussed around the topic and all that. Like you kind of mentioned that one where the allegation that Activision potentially didn't want Hex solely owning a team was definitely an eye opener. Obviously, whether that's true or not will potentially be determined in court and all that. But I do think that's an interesting component of this as well. Again, not a legal expert here at all, but if this did go to court, I know one of my friends who just casually follows Call of Duty suggested that the trial should be televised, kind of like the Johnny Depp situation there and all that stuff, which that could be some interesting content. So, yeah, not gonna pretend to really know what's gonna happen from this. It's definitely an interesting and eye-opening situation. There is, however, a world where this grabs headlines now, and it's going to potentially be a very, very long time until we hear anything in regards to this. And then there's a world where, they settle this out of court and whatever, and we just don't really hear much outside of that, unless obviously Hex or Scump decide to, you know, spill the beans on what's going on. So, yeah, definitely something, I did not have on my 2024 bingo card, Hex and Scump suing Activision, but here we are.
Yeah, it's a weird situation. I'm not really sure how to feel about it. Obviously, Activision Blizzard has done a horrible job at running the CDL. Like it hasn't advanced Call of Duty esports like in any real way, in my opinion at least. And I can see why specifically Hex and Scump would be upset with how things turned out for them, because just in the case of Scump, I know that he had talked about it in the past when he was a player about how Activision Blizzard was blocking his sponsorship, like specific sponsorships that he was being offered. And that plays into what he's alleging, that they suppressed his wages and his ability to get sponsorships, which he's saying resulted in losses of more than $20 million. So I do think that is something, like that specific part of Activision Blizzard, allegedly suppressing his ability to acquire sponsorships. I do think that is a real thing. And with Hex, the allegation that that Activision Blizzard did not want someone like him, which I think was the exact quote, to own a CDL franchise. That's interesting because it can be seen as like kind of a racial or an ethnicity thing. And I know some people took it like that. I'm not quite sure if that's what it was meant to be, because I also think that they just wanted billionaire NFL, NBA owners, the guys that you see in like the luxury boxes at the Super Bowl. Those people, I think, are what Activision Blizzard had in mind. You look at Robert Kraft, who owns Oxygen Esports, which owns the Boston Breach. Obviously Stan Kroenke and Kroenke Sports Entertainment, which own the LA Gorillas, and there are quite a few. Why, Hex would be excluded and 100 Thieves and Nadeshot would be included, because what Hex said was that he tried to buy OGLA's spot, I think after the 2020 season, and the Activision Blizzard didn't want him to buy that spot, and then it ultimately was sold to 100 Thieves, and now the Los Angeles Thieves are in that franchise spot. That just seems very weird to me, why they would pick Nadeshot and 100 Thieves over Hex and the Optic brand, which is one of, if not the strongest brand in esports in general. That just seems like an odd decision. But also, like, there's just been a lot of contention, right? This whole offseason, we've heard about Hex and Scump, Nadeshot, a ton of other people, a lot of fans specifically, that have been talking against the CDL about going back to YouTube exclusively. Hex, Scump, Nadeshot, they all said it publicly, like it wasn't worth it. They wanted to stay on Twitch or do the co-stream where you could stream on Twitch and YouTube. And I think a lot of fans agreed with that. But it seems like that's not something that the other owners might have wanted. And that kind of plays into what you were talking about as well, that initially it was believed that some other owners were supporting this and a part of this lawsuit, when in fact they're listed as involuntary co-conspirators, which means that Hex and Scump are alleging that they are helping enforce a monopoly in Call of Duty esports. Granted, the fact that the owners, it's weird though, because they're allowed to have this monopoly, like legally, at least to this point. It's their game, it's their property essentially, and they're allowed to kind of exclude anyone that they see fit. And like I was saying before we got on air, Nintendo is notorious for this. They shut down Smash Bros. Tournaments all the time, just because like they don't want certain people to run it, or they don't want this event to happen, so they shut it down. It's very unpopular. People hate Nintendo for it, but I don't think it's ever been legally challenged, and so they're allowed to do it. And Activision Blizzard is in that same vein right now, where I don't think it's ever been legally challenged whether a game publisher can just say, you can't play our game and play another game. You know, you can't make money off of our game and then make money off of another game, which is something that was also alleged, that, you know, players weren't allowed to stream or, you know, broadcast any other, you know, esports games outside of the CDL. So that, you know, there's a lot going on here. I'm not sure, just like you, what is legal, what is actually going to happen. I think it's interesting. It's definitely something to watch. I know the UFC is dealing with an antitrust lawsuit of their own that I think is going to trial in April. So that, you know, there's a lot of kind of monopoly related lawsuits going on right now, and I think it's all in the best interest. Obviously, I want, like, monopolies are a bad thing in general. Like, we've seen it with the CDL. Like, there hasn't been like a quality control. We're no better off than we were, you know, 5 years ago or whatever when the CDL started. So hopefully something good comes out of this, but I'm not quite sure if that will actually happen. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on this stuff.
Well, I was just going to say real quick, I mean, part of this, obviously this is pure speculation, but at the end of the day, you know, regardless of what happens, whether this goes to court or they settle or whatnot, what's to theoretically stop Activision from saying, like, yeah, Hex and Scump can no longer be a part of Call of Duty esports now, right? Like, you know, what if that's somehow involved in, you know,
Yeah,
the terms of this? Like, that's obviously like something Activision would greatly have to consider because of the fan appeal, the massive backlash a move like that would
sure.
lead in, and then not only, you know, like the fandom that Optic brings to tournaments, live viewership, and in-person viewership, Scump's viewership and watch parties and stuff. Like, there would be massive ramifications from something like that happening. But just, you know, again, speculating here, if something like that was potentially on the table, is that something Activision would do? Like, that, I feel like that's like probably on one very far extreme end of the spectrum in terms of potential outcomes. But it was something that popped into my head while you were talking, and, you know, again, no legal expertise here, and we're gonna have to see how this plays out, but definitely an interesting one.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the solution or the outcome is here. I don't think, like, some of the claims hold water. Granted, you know, didn't go to law school. I'm related to a lawyer, but that's about it. But, you know, like,
Ego Chall guest?
probably not. She's more into like real estate law, but I think with this lawsuit, it's kind of, you're in a tough spot because the CDL seems like it will come to an end at some point, you know, probably in the next year or maybe 2 years or whatever. And maybe this will speed up that process or make it easier for Activision Blizzard or Microsoft, really, you know, because they now own all of this, to be like, yeah, this just isn't worth our time and our money and the effort that it will go into. And really, like, maybe it's just trying to get a payday for Hex and Scump at the end of this. Like I was saying before we went on air, like, if the CDL owners get a payout similar to what the Overwatch League owners got when they decided they were going to shut down the league, I don't think Hex and Scump would necessarily be entitled to those payouts. I think the payouts would instead go to, like, Envy or, you know, whatever their parent company is called. Like, someone like Hastro would be more, you know, it would benefit him more. And Scump, he's a player, so, like, or a former player at that, so I don't know really what he would get out of that. So maybe this is an opportunity for them to kind of recoup some of the losses that they feel that they've had over the years. I'm not quite sure. Obviously, we'll learn more about it as it goes along. I hope that it goes to trial just to kind of see what all comes out. If to get that information public, that would be a big deal. But again, it's probably going to be a long process, probably not going to have a satisfying conclusion, and it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So we'll probably do periodic updates when we get new information, but I don't see this coming as like a weekly thing on the podcast that we talk about this lawsuit. Any other thoughts before we move on? All right, so let's talk about the matches. So the CDL, I think a day after that lawsuit went public, the CDL came back for the Major 2 qualifiers, which was great timing on their part. So Friday, February 16th, we had a few matches. We only had 2. Neither on paper seemed like incredible matchups, but the first turned out that way, and the second turned out to be a very good match. The first, Miami versus Toronto, we talked about it last week. Miami had the Ultra and Atlanta FaZe on their schedule this week, which is pretty much the worst combination of teams that you could face, especially with Eric Boom coming into the lineup, making his CDL debut. That's like going right into the meat grinder. It's not a very fun experience. So Miami got swept by the Ultra. And then Carolina and New York in that second match of the day. New York ended up coming back, reverse sweeping the Royal Ravens and winning after a very disappointing Major 1. Any takeaways from these 2 matches on Friday?
Yeah, I mean, kind of a theme throughout this entire week, but we saw in the Toronto-Miami series, we saw Rio played both maps 1 and 2, so we saw the first Rio Hardpoint and the first Rio Search. Since Rio joined the map pool, we saw it in total. That was the only Rio Search of the week, but Rio Hardpoint was played 5 times. It was played all 3 series on Sunday. Played in Miami versus FaZe, so yeah, 4, and then in this Miami series, so yeah, 5 out of the 8 series played it. Now, does that mean Rio is a good map, or does it mean that these teams are experimenting a little bit, trying to test the waters and expand their map pool potentially? Could be a yes to both of those, could be a no, mixed answer. Well, we won't know really till we get a better sample size, but it is kind of interesting to see a new map added and it being, kind of thrown into the fire right away. With the, just the general result there, kind of like you said, Miami had a tough schedule going up against the defending champs, and Toronto didn't take their foot off the gas and took care of business right there in their first match of this qualifier, picking up where they left off. In the second match there between Carolina and New York, this is a rematch of the match where Carolina eliminated New York in Major 1 to kind of solidify New York's lackluster performance at that major. And, first 2 maps is a nail biter in the hardpoint, 250, 245. The Search, 6-1, wasn't even close, really. That was one thing we've talked about kind of extensively now with this Carolina team since bringing in Fellow and TJ Halley, is that, they didn't have the practice in Search, but they have the players with a S&D background to potentially be a good search and destroy team. And, they're up 2-0 against New York after beating them at the major, kind of, starting to think, is this a giant red flag for New York? What's going on? And then New York flipped the script. They get their own 6-1 in the map 5, a 250 to 100 in the map 4 hardpoint, and they're able to close out a reverse sweep. So that was an interesting series there, especially for a rematch and for the first time seeing New York back in action after that subpar performance at Major 1. So it was important for them to respond, especially after going down 0-2.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that, it went map 5, but there were only really 2 close maps. It was a blowout in the searches, and then nearly 100-point club hard point in that second one. Subbase always kind of delivers. It's just kind of a shit show, to be honest. Like I think it's the most hated hard point map by players, but the way it's set up, I think, just leads to some of these really good competitive maps, and 250, 245 is about as close as you can get. Impressive win for New York. Carolina, obviously, letting it slip away. That's kind of what you expect. You see it a lot in COD because good teams find a way most of the time, and these bad or middling teams, they have the capability of winning some of these matches against some of the better teams, but they also likely let it slip away more times than not, and we've seen Carolina struggle to put away some teams. So not a great start to their Major 2 qualifiers, but there are also quite a few weeks of qualifiers to fill. And we'll talk about their next match right now because they kicked off Saturday as well after getting beaten by New York to finish Friday. The Royal Ravens played Boston, and this was interesting because obviously the Breach were debuting a new iteration of their roster, ASIM coming in for Capsidal, and we both talked about it, how we didn't know what to really make of the Breach, as with it was pretty much half the league we said that about, but ASIM hadn't played in the CDL this season so far, but he looked pretty good. Boston looked pretty good. They end up winning this series 3-1 to get their first win of the Major 2 qualifiers. Any takeaway from ASIM's not CDL debut, but his CDL season debut in this new Boston, this new look for Boston?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that really stood out to me in this one was especially on the Carolina side, was it was another case of Gwyn playing very well in a losing effort. He had 31 map 1 when they lose. Carolina wins the search, which kind of goes back to what we talked about before, of this potentially being a good search team, and now they got some reps under them. Obviously, they had a map 5 loss to New York in the previous series, but that would mean they're 2-1 so far in search, so could be worse in that regard. But especially for a new team like Boston, to see them come out and be strong in hardpoint, which is probably a lot more scrim than search and destroy, makes a little bit of sense. ASIM in particular stood out in map 3 with 35 kills, and the other thing, might not be super shocking considering Boston won all 3 respawns, but if we're looking at KDs, all 4 players on Boston were positive. The lowest was actually ASIM with a 1.04, but had the second most kills, only one behind Snoopy's 87 at 86, and Gwyn had 87 for Carolina. But on Carolina, Gwyn was the only player positive, and the other 3 were in the 0.8 range, if I'm seeing that right. Yep, 0.8. So, yeah, obviously, KD's not everything, but that's got to be a good sign for Boston fans, especially, like you said, first match with ASIM. Not the toughest competition going up against Carolina, but we've said it a billion times on this podcast now. You can only play the team put in front of you, so Boston fans are probably happy to start this qualifier off on a good note.
I thought it was interesting that Carolina went 2-1 in search and went 0-2 in their matches this week. That happens. New York is a good team. Boston, we really don't know what their ceiling is with ASIM in the lineup, so we're kind of figuring that out as we go through. And they only had 1 match this week, so it's pretty small sample size to go off of that. But I just thought it was interesting that Carolina, the game mode that you would think that it would take the longest to adjust to, that they actually had quite a bit of success in those 2 matches, but still weren't able to pick up wins.
And just real quick too, Brian Saint tweeted after this match here. Brian Saint being the head coach and GM, I think head coach and GM of the Royal Ravens, tweeted, "Just incapable of closing right now. GG's to Boston, lost 3-1. Could have very well been a 2-0 weekend with a 6-0 map count." Obviously, we mentioned the reverse sweep with New York, but that's certainly an interesting way to look at it. It kind of speaks to potentially where that mindset is for Carolina. Like, there are a lot of teams that would probably be down after, starting 0-2 and stuff, but I think that's kind of like a positive mindset to have, is like, yeah, we, tighten up a few mistakes. Instead of being 0-2, we very well could have been 2-0. So, interesting way of looking at it, and we'll have to see how they respond this week. But, yeah.
Yeah, I think they have a decent chance of bouncing back next week. Just they only have one match, so they get to completely focus on that opponent. They don't have to, prepare for two. And the team that they're playing also made a roster change, so it's kind of a double whammy there. But now we go to the next match, which was Atlanta and Miami. Like we talked about at the beginning of the segment, Miami had the two hardest opponents to play, and they finished the week with 0 wins and 2 losses. Now with Eric Boom in the lineup, they did take a map off of Atlanta, which is an improvement over the 3-0 loss to Toronto. I mean, it's just gonna happen. Like, I think these are scheduled losses. Like, no matter what lineup it was gonna be, I would have picked Miami to go 0-2, especially with how, like, Toronto looked incredible at Major 1. Atlanta, I think, only lost to Toronto at Major 1. FaZe was definitively the second best team. So, to lose to those two teams in the same week, it's bad luck, of course. You don't want to start 0-2, but, you don't have to play them again, for a little bit. So that's kind of the good news about it. Any thoughts on this series, the 3-1 win for Atlanta FaZe?
I mean, we were just talking about, alternate possibilities with Carolina. In this series, Miami wins the map 1 by 99 points, goes to a round 11, and map 2, if that round 11 goes the other way, Miami's potentially up 2-0 in this series, and then who knows what happens from there. But obviously that's not how this one played out. So yeah, like you said, tough to judge the new look Miami team off of these two matches, especially when kind of expected results going up against the teams that came in first and second at the first major of the year. So we'll be interested to see how Miami responds against, whoever they're playing this upcoming week. It can't be the teams that came in first and second, so they technically the schedule only gets easier from him from this point on for them now. So yeah, the other bit of news attached to Miami that's interesting is Real, who was on Carolina earlier this year and had some visa issues, has been signed by Miami as a substitute. I think this is a little interesting considering Miami was one of those few teams that already had a substitute, had a 5-man roster, already dipped into that 5-man roster. So now they technically have a 6-man roster. What does that mean for, Journey's potential future with this team? Or is like Real kind of just like sliding in to be that true sub, and then Journey's kind of just in the background? Not really sure what that is there, but to me, it's obviously a credit to Real that he's getting an opportunity this soon after the visa issues and all that. It would have sucked if something out of his control really just hindered him, and it still technically is because he's not actually in the league competing on a starting spot, but this is the closest step to getting back to that reality. So yeah, I think it's interesting that especially a newer team like Miami being willing to spend, in theory they have to sign Real to a minimum contract at the lowest there, at least a minimum contract. So at least spending $50,000 to get him as a sub, in theory, I guess. But yeah, we'll have to see if it actually materializes into anything. But it's an option for them, especially if things continue to go the way that they went this past week for Miami. But again, small sample size for a new roster against two juggernauts in the league. So not expecting Real to be thrown in right now. We'll have to see how Miami does against the rest of the league.
Yeah, I mean they're kind of cornering the market on Spanish Call of Duty players at this point. They have 6 players under contract, all Spanish. I don't know if there's any other Spanish Call of Duty players like in the CDL at least. But I mean, I think it fits perfectly for them because it's kind of a low risk, high reward signing because Real wasn't benched because of his performance. Like you said, it was the visa issues. In Carolina, I think at some point was just like, we have to move on. Like we can't just keep holding out hope. We got to, stick with TJ in this spot. And Carolina did look better with TJ. Granted, it was also with Fellow replacing Godorex, so that's kind of a that's also a difference. But Carolina, they moved on from Real, and Miami is the beneficiaries of that if he can get his visa issues fixed and resolved and become a CDL player again. I do think if he is able to, figure out all those issues, then he will likely be in the CDL by the end of the season. But I love it. I love that Miami is, taking a chance on him, and hopefully they keep Journey on the bench or kind of move people around, because it's kind of lame that teams just essentially release their substitute anytime they sign a new one. It's nice when you have multiple options that you can look at when you're making a roster change, and they have that ability if they keep Journey as well as Real as substitutes right now. Next match, New York versus Seattle, the last match on Saturday. Debut for Brezzy, who took over for Illy. I thought this was just weird that they didn't say anything about it. It doesn't happen like that almost ever. Usually there's a thank you or some kind of acknowledgement that this player is not. I don't think he's been released, because if he was released, then that's even worse.
Yeah.
But even okay, he's going to be on the bench and we're starting Brezzy in place of him. Usually there is something like that. Seattle did put out a graphic, with Brezzy in the graphic, so people were like, this is kind of a weird way to announce that he's a new starter for Illy. But I mean, granted, we don't know all of the specifics, so maybe it makes more sense for the way they did it. But it did not work out for them on the server. New York ends up sweeping the Surge in 3 games. None of these maps were particularly close. And Brezzy ended up with a 0.69 KD for the series, which was the lowest of any of the 8 players. So any thoughts on Brezzy's debut for the CDL and for Seattle's debut for this roster?
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of like you said, the most interesting aspect is what happened off the server in my eyes, and the fact that nothing about Illy in particular was really said really just adds further adds further fuel to the fires of speculation around what's going on behind the scenes there, and some potential shadow ban or potential unofficial suspension or whatever. Regardless of whatever's going on there, new Seattle squad didn't stack up to a New York team that, now they've won 6 maps in a row, counting this series. But before that, and heading into the match against Carolina, obviously, it's not the same New York team that was coming off a very successful year last year. And even though New York played well in the qualifiers leading up to Major 1, they had that, stumble on land to start this year. So, if you're gonna play that New York team at any point with a new roster, this was probably the time to try and get them, and just didn't work out for them. So, there's a lot of speculation and all that around the Seattle change, and one of the points being that Illy was one of the better players, especially on land statistically. So when you're taking away potentially the best statistical player on the team, and replacing him with anybody who's just not matching or improving those statistics, it's no surprise that things aren't going to work out. So we'll have to see how this plays out and what comes from this, how long Rezzy's in the lineup, especially if he struggles and Seattle struggles as a whole. But yeah, we'll have to see what comes from this and the rest of Seattle's action.
Yeah, and like I said last week, even more difficult because Illy, like his prowess is an S&D, and that is also Seattle's best game mode. So they're struggling in hardpoint and control, no matter who's in the lineup at this point. But if the S&D also goes, then they're gonna plummet to the bottom of the standings. Like they can't win series if they can't win any of the 3 game modes consistently, and that is my fear without Illy. Even with Illy, it's going to be a chore and very dependent on the matchup. Sunday, February 18th, we had 3 matches to finish out the week. First, we had the PSOG Bowl, the Los Angeles Guerrillas versus the Las Vegas Legion. Interesting matchup here. I think, obviously, with Vegas debuting a new iteration of their roster, Gio making his CDL debut in place of Standy. I thought this was a pretty intriguing matchup. And Vegas ends up winning this 3-2, but quite a few very close maps in this series, including a 250 to 236 Rio hardpoint to finish out the series. Gio didn't have his best series. It's kind of hard for a rookie coming in to make a big impact regardless, but he did do pretty well in the control, and they won the series, which is the most important part. Your thoughts on Vegas's win here over LAG?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of evens things up a little bit from the first PSOG Bowl where Tremy got the prediction wrong for you. You stuck with Vegas here and you got it right this time. So, yeah, I think that's, my head for this one was new roster for Vegas. You don't really know what's going on, how they're going to shake up. And, although LAG aren't technically a top team, they've had some flashes of brilliance and flashes of potential early in this season, and they didn't make any changes. So I thought chemistry-wise, all that good stuff, they potentially had an edge in the series, but just didn't materialize that way. And by far the best moment from this series was Attach flipping off the camera and giving the bird to, I don't know who he would necessarily be yelling at in that, because I don't, maybe there's some beef with the other guys, but thinking of Attach being a pro for so long, Assault's the only real long-time pro on LAG. Maybe it was Fame because they teamed together with Fame last year.
Some people were speculating that he was flipping off people that were doubting Gio coming into the lineup. But,
sure.
I mean, that's all speculation. He could be flipping off anybody. He could be flipping off Trimmer for picking against Vegas. So, but yeah, I don't know who that was directed at, but it is very good. I enjoy when the guys get a little spicy after the games.
Oh yeah. And I mean, hey, Attach dropped to 1.43 in the series, 87 and 61, most kills by far in the series, and the highest KD by over 0.3. So you put up a performance like that with those numbers, I guess you can kind of do whatever you want afterwards.
Yeah, he dropped 10 in the search, 32 in the control, so a big series from him. Minnesota versus Toronto was a interesting series just because it was a lot closer than I imagined it would be. Granted, Minnesota did have a very good performance at Major 1, but Toronto had the best performance, definitely proved that they're the best team in the league, and I just thought, all right, Toronto will kind of take care of business. They did in the first hard point, but round 11 search Ultra just squeak it out, and then Minnesota makes the comeback, forces a game 5. Granted, game 5 was a stomp, a pretty rare 6-0 for Toronto, but forcing the Ultra to a game 5 when they've looked leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else. I thought that was really impressive. Did you have the same takeaway with Minnesota forcing a Game 5 against the Ultra?
Yeah, I think that's where my head's at too, is that we just saw this matchup at the major, and obviously, people can make the LAN versus online debate for all eternity, but end of the day, we just saw this on LAN. It was a 3-0 for Toronto, and then we see this matchup right after that, and Minnesota, could have gotten 3-0 in this, but they definitely made Toronto work for it. So it could be signs potentially of Minnesota improving. Could also be a sign of, I'd have to look at what the actual maps were in that Toronto Minnesota series at the major versus this one. Maybe well, I know obviously Rio wasn't played at the major, and that's one of the maps Minnesota won. But
Yeah.
Still, regardless, I think, Minnesota had a really slow start to this year in the qualifiers. At one point before the winter break, they were literally the only team without a win in last place, and they really seem to have kicked it up a notch. And the fact they're able to get 2 maps here off of Toronto, that might be something at the end of these qualifiers. If Toronto ends up being 7-0, or I don't even know the number of qualifier matches they're playing this, but if Toronto ends up undefeated at the end of these qualifiers, those 2 map wins they stole for Minnesota could play a factor in Minnesota's tiebreakers and whatnot for where they are in the standings heading into the next major.
Yeah, I do think they play 7 matches online qualifiers for this. And the first 2 maps of this series were the same maps of the first 2 maps in that last series. Skid Row Hardpoint to start, Karachi Search as the second map. Bigger win for Toronto on Skid Row, and then the last time they played it was 6-3 on Karachi, this time 6-5 on Karachi, and then that first series had Invasion Control. This one had Karachi Control, which Minnesota won. They forced the Rio Hardpoint, like you said, and then Invasion Search to finish it out. So, definitely some learning experiences. I'm sure that Minnesota is taking that into account. Like, you lost 6-3 on Karachi Search, then you lost a round 11 on Karachi Search. Maybe the next time you can win round 11, maybe you can win that map in general. Skid Row does not look like it's going to be won, but I'm sure they've learned quite a bit from those 2 maps.
The interesting thing about it being the first 2 matches in particular, that we're saying, the first 2 maps, is that obviously the way vetoes works is that one team would be picking map 1 and the other team would be picking map 2.
Yeah.
Based on how the veto system has worked in the past, the higher seed should get to decide whether they want to be team A or team B. So you would assume that in both of these matches, Toronto had that opportunity to pick which team to be. So we don't know which one of these they would have picked, but that makes you think that no matter how it shakes down, one of these teams picked map 1, the other picked map 2, and it's a map that both of those teams feel strong on, especially in this matchup. But at the end of the day, Toronto's 4-0 against Minnesota on these 2 maps in particular. So that's a little interesting to me, but maybe that's something as we see this matchup inevitably a couple more times this season. We'll have to keep an eye on how that plays out.
Yeah, definitely. Last match for the week, Optic versus LAT HBR Classic, as we know it to be. Not a particularly competitive one. 3-0 sweep for Optic. LAT debuted a new roster, keeping Afro and Ghosty, but adding Crimp and Nasty into the lineup. Obviously, things did not work out. This is again, Optic is a bad team to debut a roster against as well, because they are a pretty strong team, all things considered. Map 1, big blowout. Map 2 wasn't really close, and map 3 did go to a round 5 of the control, but Optic won. So any thoughts, any opinions on LAT's new roster? They only had 1 match, and it is against Optic, so it's kind of like the Eric Boom Miami thing. It's kind of like, all right, let's see what you got next week now.
Yeah, I mean, that's you're playing against the 3rd place teams from Major 1, so if you're not going to have the toughest 2 matchups, since Miami had those, you got the one right after that. So yeah, even smaller sample size though too than Miami because obviously we only see LAT in one series as opposed to two.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, it is interesting to see Rio getting thrown into it. New team kind of talked about. Um, well, I don't know if Rio was used in challengers before the CDL or not.
I don't think so, but I could be
Yeah, I
wrong.
don't think so. Yeah, but regardless of that, it wouldn't be surprising to me to see a new team trying out a new map and uh giving, might as well we talked about LAT's hardpoint woes with the previous iteration, like, you know, if nothing was working on those other maps, you might as well try the new one and see what you got there. But no, in all seriousness, gonna have to see more sample size out of this LAT team to see what they got cooking over there and if we can expect any better results from them going forward.
Yeah, I actually forgot, but that was something I was going to mention about Miami. They played Rio 3 times
Yeah.
in the opening week. They lost all three, granted, but it looks like they're willing to try it out. Maybe early on, it's better to see what they have in Rio, and maybe that could be a part of the map rotation going forward. So that does it for the last week, or the first week, our last week of the qualifiers. Pretty short week. There weren't a ton of matches, but they're kind of spread out over a longer period now. It's not as condensed. So I think there are 5 weeks or 6 weeks of qualifiers for some godforsaken reason. But we both did pretty well in this week. We both went 7-1. So you picked LAG over Vegas. That was your only loss, and I picked Carolina over Boston. So we kind of bet against new rosters, and that screwed us. I bet against the new Boston roster. You bet against my boy Gio, my sweet precious
Oh,
boy Gio. Yeah, he's debuting in
he's
the
getting a
PSOG
jersey.
Bowl. Yeah, he is literally like, he is our halftime performer at the Super Bowl. Essentially, he is the main event. But we both went 7-1, so you're 46-22 on the season. I'm 47-21. Trimmer still 0.0000% win percentage, as 0-1 this season. And that was a PSOG Bowl loss, so that's like negative percentage if that even was a thing for this kind of stuff. But let's get into the matches for Major 2 Week 2 qualifiers. Starting with Friday, February 23rd, we're starting off with the Yankees and Red Sox, or the Subliners and the Breach. This is a Priesta revenge game, so this is potentially this does feel like an actual revenge game. Like, we always bring it up kind of as a joke, but this feels like there is some kind of, I mean, he literally got dropped from the world championship team. That feels more personal than some of the other ones. I'm still going to go with the Subliners considering they went 2-0, but I could see Boston pointing this out. And ASIM was also a part of the Subliners, I believe, at some point. So
Yeah.
more revenge games, the better. Are you going with New York or Boston?
Yeah, I mean, especially when you put it New York Yankees versus Red Sox, I almost got to go with New York there. But I'm looking it up real quick too. I'm pretty sure they already played in the Major One qualifiers, if I'm not mistaken. Um,
Yeah, but this is more real because I realized that it was happening in the moment. So this is the real revenge game. That was just a warm up the last
I
time they
can't.
played.
Yeah, I can't find it. I'd have to go back and look, and that's COD Gamepedia is not cooperating with me right now. But yeah, regardless of the revenge game, I'm gonna go in New York here.
They did play, yes. It was
Yeah.
3-2 the last week of the qualifiers on Major 1 for New York. But again, this is more real. So Minnesota versus Optic. Breakdown. I always think of breakdown now that Optic and Minnesota play. I'm going to go with Optic, but Minnesota has looked really good over the past few weeks.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Optic too, but could be an upset alert here.
This one, I have absolutely no idea where to go.
Yep.
Miami versus Vegas. Miami went 0-2 in their first week with Eric Boom. They've lost, I think, 4 straight matches now. Dating back to Major 1, they went 0-6 at Major 1. They've won 1 map, so they've lost, what is that, 12 of their last 13 maps as a team. Granted, it is a different roster, or a different iteration of the roster. I'm going to go with Vegas. Maybe the momentum of the Legion picking up that first win with Geo, even if he didn't play his best, maybe that can help them overcome the Heretics.
Yeah, and I'm going to go with Miami purely because I have no idea where my head is at with this one, and I just want to have a pick that's different from you, so we have a potential shift in the pick-up standings.
Yeah. Vegas versus Toronto. I don't believe in my boy Geo and the Legion like that, so I'm going to go with the Ultra.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Toronto.
LAG versus Optic. I also don't believe in LAG like that, so I'm going to go with Optic.
I will go with Optic as well.
And then we're back to another match that we have no idea what's going on with. Miami, again, they finish out Saturday against the Los Angeles Thieves, who have played 1 match, 3 maps total with this new roster, with Nasty in the lineup. And let me try to... Who is the other guy? Nasty and... Kremp, thank you. I always forget at least one person per episode. So congratulations to Kremp. But LAT has very minimal experience with this roster. Miami has pretty minimal experience with Eric Boom in the lineup. I'll go with Miami. I feel very confident that LAT is actually bad this year. Granted, they might make me look stupid with this pick, but I'm going to go with the Heretics.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Miami too, just because, I don't know what to expect from either team, but at least earlier in the season, Miami had some success in online matches against weaker teams. LAT has looked like one of the weaker teams, so that's where my head's at with this one. I'll take Miami.
That is literally my thought process. Like, I can picture the Heretics winning because they won more matches than LAT. I just can't actually envision LAT winning, but I'm sure they'll make me pay for that.
Probably.
Sunday, February 25th, we have 3 matches. Seattle versus Carolina, I really don't know. I think these are the 2 best rookies, or 2 of the best, because I think Snoopy's also had a really good season, but Abuza has looked really good. Gwen, as you've been shouting him out pretty much on every episode, despite the record, he's had really good individual performances. I'm going to go with Carolina because I have no idea what Seattle's supposed to be good at. With Brezzy, maybe more matches will give me a better idea, but right now I'm going to go with the Ravens.
And that was my thought process here is, I'm on the Gwen train, 2 teams again, especially for small sample size for new Seattle, but don't really know what to expect from them. And kind of like you mentioned when we were talking about Seattle earlier, Seattle's strength with Illy was S&D. He's no longer a factor, and Carolina just won 2 S&Ds this past week. Seem to be improving in the mode, especially with the S&D talent they have. So I'm going to go with Gwen carrying in the respawns, and then the S&D guys stepping up in there to help Carolina get a win here.
Yeah. Minnesota, Boston. I want to go with Minnesota, but I like ASIM. Like I'll go with Boston. I'm not feeling great about it.
Not to, full disclosure, I had Boston down, and this was the only one I flipped the script on and I switched to Minnesota, so it's definitely possible that comes back to bite me. But yeah, I just think after thinking about it for a little bit, Minnesota's been playing really well lately, and even kind of like we highlighted, they don't get a win against Toronto, but not really anybody is except for Boston, I guess, which that could be a narrative. But regardless, the Minnesota just played them really tough, them being Toronto. So things seem to be on a positive trajectory for Minnesota, and that's what I'm going to pick them here.
Yeah, I just think, I think Minnesota might be a little bit overrated. I don't think they're the fourth best team in the league, but I think that's what they are in the standings at the moment.
Yeah.
No, they're just outside. They're fifth. But I don't think Boston is necessarily the third to worst team like they are in the standings. So I think they're decently even, and it'll
Sure.
be a competitive series. Final match of the weekend is a banger. Always love these championship contenders playing each other. Atlanta FaZe versus the New York Subliners. New York Online has looked really, really good. The LAN stuff really bad. But FaZe has looked good all the time. Just like they've only lost to Toronto, really. So like I'm not gonna hold that against them too much. So I'm gonna go with FaZe.
Yep, you can do 2 FaZe up. Give me Atlanta.
So that does it for the predictions. I don't think we have anything else to talk about. But thank you guys for watching. Oh, I did want to just give a brief update on the standings. Not the major 2 qualifiers because some teams only played 1 match, but this is the season standings. So Toronto, first place. They're ahead by 25 points, so a little bit of a cushion over Atlanta FaZe, who's in second. FaZe has a 45-point advantage on Optic in third. Optic's got a 30-point advantage on New York in fourth. And then it starts to bunch up a little bit. New York has 80 points. Minnesota in fifth has 75. Seattle in sixth has 60. And then Miami and LAG are tied for seventh and eighth with 50 points. So that's your top 8 right now. So if the season ended today, the teams that would not make it to champs would be Vegas, Boston, Carolina, and LAT, who seem like the 4, maybe Boston could be lifted out of there at some point. But it does seem like there's a pretty clear like top 5 at the moment. And then right now we're looking at maybe these new rosters will change that. But Boston right now is in 10th. Vegas is in 9th. So Vegas is 15 points behind LAG. Then Boston is 5 points behind Vegas. And then Carolina in 11th is 5 points behind Boston. And LAT, the world champions from 2 years ago, granted, nobody is there from that world championship roster, but they are dead last in the CDL at the moment with 20 points. They're 2-7 on the season, a 10-23 map count. That is absolutely ridiculous. How the mighty have fallen. But that is your CDL standings update. I did want to just do that because we'll start doing the major 2 qualifiers update once teams have actually played substantial matches, and we can kind of look at what teams need to do over the remaining few weeks of the qualifiers. But yeah, that does it for the show. Make sure to like, subscribe, or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're on YouTube. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and you should like all of those. You should subscribe to every single thing that has ever existed that pertains to the Ego Chall Podcast. You should follow us on Twitter. He is at jbink with 2 Ks. I'm at Preston Byers, and the podcast store is at Ego Chall Podcast. The next show will be sometime next week. Could be Sunday, could be Monday, could be Tuesday, could be Wednesday. We don't know, so don't ask. And we will be back to talk about some CDL. We'll be talking about how the Miami Heretics ended up with a 2-0 week and what we're supposed to make of that. Maybe we'll be talking about Minnesota upsetting Optic and whether that has anything to do with accuracy. And I mean, if accuracy in Minnesota beat Optic again, I think he should be king of Optic at that point. Like, he kind of owns it. He's kind of like the contractor for the green wall. He can kind of build it and he can break it down wherever he wants.
Interesting debate there could be,
is the Iceman too much for Optic?
I'm gonna say, is he the new age Aches? Obviously, Aches historically was the guy who, you needed someone to take down the green wall. That's your guy, but now with Aches no longer competing, does accuracy fill that role? And side note, Aches did tweet with the Hex and Scump lawsuit stuff after we were talking about that earlier, that he tweeted something like when he woke up the next day after the tweets and like it was fake texts from Activision and missed calls like saying we need you or whatever.
Yeah.
And I thought that was potentially one of the greatest tweets I ever saw. It's obviously in a taking, making fun, not making fun, but making a joke of a very serious legal situation like that, and all the seriousness of that aside, I thought that was a very entertaining tweet.
Aches is never wrong. He's just early. Remember that. Accuracy, he can be the antagonist, but he needs to be more of an antagonist. He's kind of like Eli Manning against the Patriots. Like he just like by himself, just like, yeah, I don't know why more people don't do this. Yeah, the Iceman is great. But yeah, that does it for the podcast. We'll be back next week to talk about the matches and give our predictions for the third week of qualifiers. But that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for all the support, and we'll see you right back here whenever we decide to go live with the next week of stuff to talk about. Who knows? Maybe we'll have another surprise lawsuit to talk about too on top of the games again. But until then, we'll see you next time, and remember to send the chow.